My name is Daniel Wallace. I have been working for Salt since March of 2016. I've been working on Salt for about 2 years longer than that, and before that I was working at Rackspace doing system administration work. Right now at Salt, I'm in charge of maintaining Salt Cloud, the Salt Package Manager, Kitchen Salt, and then I'm working with our ops guy to redo the way that we do all of our testing suite stuff. How many people are familiar with Test Kitchen from the Ruby or Puppet world? Great. The point of Test Kitchen is to be able to test one iteration of your states or multiple iterations of or pass through your states from a containerized instance, either using containers, using Vagrant, or probably what I would like to see happen more is to test on your production infrastructure. So if you're using OpenStack, you test an OpenStack. If you're using Amazon, you use Amazon to test your states using Kitchen. This talk is going to be going over the example formula that is at the following URL. We're just going to be installing WordPress, but we're not going to do, that's not going to be the main focus, obviously. There's a couple things about Kitchen that you need to know. It uses Ruby. It is not Python based. We talked for a while about if it was worthwhile to rewrite our own thing using Python, and basically we came down to the fact that Test Kitchen already has drivers and provisioners and everything else already written in there. It would be better to have the rest of the community manage that Test Kitchen community manage OpenStack and OpenNebula and the AWS drivers, and us to just focus on the Salt provisioner portion of this. These are some of the key commands that you'll be using. Lists off all of your tests that will run. Create will create the instance. Converge installs your provisioner and then provisions the box using, in this case, Salt, since we're using Kitchen Salt. Verify will run your unit tests against the box. If you create or converge or verify, there will be an instance left behind, and you can use Kitchen login, and it will SSH to the instance so that you can work in your testing environment. And then there's destroy, and destroy just deletes them all at the end. Test does all of them in a row from create except for login. It does a create, it does a converge, it does a verify, and then it does a destroy to clean up at the end. And then it gives you a 1 or 0 if your test passed or failed. Next, we're going to go through configuring Kitchen Salt. There's basically 5 main sections. You'll probably only use 3, maybe 4 of them. The first one's the driver. This talk is going to go through and use Docker, but there's obviously other ones, Amazon, Linode, DigitalOcean. There's a ton of them. But for local use and what we're using for pushing out to the community is going to be focused around Docker. For our internal stuff, since our internal cloud is OpenNebula, we'll be using the OpenNebula one, and we'll talk about that later. Basically, all you're configuring here is what the name of it is, and then each one of the different drivers has different configuration values that are specific to that. This one basically says we don't want to run Docker with sudo, so it won't do sudo Docker. It'll just run Docker with the user that is running Kitchen. It does create a privilege container, and this should say 80, so it's going to forward port 80 to a random port on the host Docker engine. Next is platform. Platform is where you put all the information about your operating system that you're going to use. It supports FreeBSD, most of the Linuxes. It supports Windows, so you can test your states against Windows boxes. In the case of Docker, Docker only runs SSH as its primary exec command, and we want to test starting services, so we're using systemd for CentOS and OpenSUSE. Each one of the platforms is also, so you have this big long file, and each section is also configured, like the provisioner driver, which we're going to get to in a minute, is configured in this section. You can customize your driver config in these sections so that each different, sometimes each different operating system requires a little bit different treatment, as you can see here with the OpenSUSE does not come with SSHD enabled when it's installed, whereas CentOS does. Next we're going to talk, so the next section that you're going to use is suites. And suites can be something as simple as default. If you just have one suite and you just want to run one test path, you would do that. In my case, this one, we're going to be testing against Nitrogen, which is 2017.7, and Develop, so that I can future-proof my WordPress formula to make sure that it'll work on the next version of Salt when it's released. And as you can see here, the only difference is we specify a separate bootstrap options, whereas the default bootstrap options will just install the latest stable. With the develop one, I want to install the develop version through bootstrap. Are there any questions so far? Okay. Before we get to the Salt portion, there's a provisioner. Your provisioner is basically just unit tests. Since it is Salt and we like Python, this is where we get to use Python. Once once you get past this portion, all you're going to be writing is either Salt states or Python unit tests to test your environment. And there will be different environment variables based on those suites so that you can run different unit tests per suite that you're testing. Does that make sense to everyone? There's the suite portion, and we move down. Great. Now we get to the real meat of what we have pulled into the Salt community. So we started talking about how we wanted to, the community has been asking for a way to test Salt states for a long time now. And we never could get it together to pick something or write something. So we finally sat down and said, we just need to take kitchen salt and run with it. Perfect. So I'm just going to move over to here. This is what the kitchen.yml looks like. And you'll see the driver, and then down at the bottom is the platforms, the suite, and the verifier. And then what you see in the middle is the Salt portion. And we'll just start at the top from there. You specify that you're going to use the Salt provisioner. This says since Test Kitchen is managed by ops code, obviously we had the name for the Salt would follow Chef Solo, so it's Salt Solo. And then you choose which way you want to install Salt in your instance. By default, it uses Bootstrap, but it can also use the distribution package, which is going to be old. It can use pip. You can specify a yum repository and apt repository. There's a whole, like basically all the ways that you can install Salt usually it supports. Windows is slightly different, obviously, because but you have to specify a different Windows Bootstrap script. But otherwise, it's once you get past this point, it's all basically the same. So for Bootstrap, we're going to specify that we're going to install git, curl, and sudo because we want to use those later instead of writing states for them. Since they're usually installed on the default CentOS images, we don't actually need to provide states for them. And then we get to the next one, which is file root, which says the top directory of the Git repository is the /serve/salt file root. And everything from this Git repository is going to be copied to there on the instance. There are several other ways to do this. There's formulas. So if you're developing like a formula for Linux users, you can just say, or let's say that you're using this Apache formula down below. In the Apache formula on SaltStack formulas, there's an Apache directory. So you tell it we're the Apache formula, and all it will copy is that Apache directory onto the instance. There's a couple other ones in there that are in the documentation, which I'm working on filling out or rewriting. The next section is if you're using inspect or something that uses Chef in order to test your instance, you may require Chef be installed in order to do your verifier later. At this point, you would require Chef, and it'll install Chef inside of the instance. I'm using test infra for my test, so I do not need that. Salt copy filter is a list of directories and files that we're not going to copy into the instance from the local repository. And then dependencies are going to be the stuff that my formula depends on. So my formula uses Apache, the Apache states, it uses the MySQL states, and it uses the PHP states, and it pulls them all from Git. You can also specify your dependencies can come from Git, they can come from SPM, they can come from local file paths on the system, they can come from apt packages or yum packages, and there's another directive that's called vendor repos, so that you can set up those repositories inside of the instance as well. But since we're just using Git, we just have to have Git installed in order to pull the repositories down. The next section is the state top. Right now, this only runs a high state, so you'll just specify which states you want to run for this instance of Salt for the test run. And then below that, you'll recognize pillars with a top.sls. These get dropped into the pillar root on the instance, and then they will be used for our test suite. I've included a password because in your own environment, you wouldn't obviously use this password. Just a randomly generated one to test states works. Other than that, these are the defaults required to run the MySQL formula. And then at the bottom is the defaults required for the WordPress formula. And then what will happen is it will build the instance, it will run the states on the server, and then it will run the verifier at the end. So we are just going to start with that. So I've already run this once today, so it creates the Salt instance, or it creates the container. It installs an SSH key inside of it, and then it boots the system, and then it waits for SSH here. Once that's done, it starts the converge sequence. It creates a sandbox environment on our local machine, and then it starts copying files over into there. It prepares the pillars into that sandbox. On the local machine, it starts and checks if it's a state collection, and then it creates the state top, and then it adds any extra scripts that you want to run. And then once all that's done, it will start transferring over to /temp/kitchen onto the testing instance. And then it will run whatever install method that we have told it to do. Are there any questions?
So you mentioned this is just going to run a high state. So this is pretty particular to your WordPress test. If you wanted to make it like kind of generic, where let's say if you had your multiple formulas there, is there a way to like parameterize that? So you could say like just have a generic test kitchen config for all of your formulas?
So the question was, could you have a generic test kitchen config for all of your formulas?
Yeah, so like if you're doing a push in your MySQL state, you want to know that you didn't break anything, right? Right. So you might want to test like MySQL and Apache with your PHP or whatever. Like,
right. So that's where the suites come in. If you just want to test MySQL and Apache, when you push to MySQL, inside of the MySQL formula, you would create a suite that just installs Apache and MySQL, and you can do that like, so everything that's in this provisioner command, let's make that a lot bigger. Everything that's in this provisioner command can just be copied and put down here under the suite. So as you can see, there's provisioner here. And we can just modify this so that you have state_top base asterisk, Apache, MySQL. And so you can customize them as you want inside of your suite. So for every different iteration of thing that you want to do, you would need a different suite. So everything in the provisioner can be overwritten inside of your suite. So right now, what it's doing is it's actually running the high state. I wish I had turned on the. What you'll see. Okay, so what'll happen is it has finished installing Salt here, and we double check that we have installed the correct version of Salt, and then it starts installing the external dependencies. It clones these Git repositories into user share salt-formulas env_formulas, and then we copy them over to /temp/kitchen/serve/salt. You can see that here where all of the formulas have been copied into, including the modules and states for WordPress. And it does take a minute. So what's happening is all that we're doing is we're going to run these 3 formulas out of PHP. We're going to run the Apache formula, we run the MySQL formula, and then we run the WordPress setup. This state is going to, this test works on OpenSUSE, it works on Ubuntu 16.04 and Debian 9 and CentOS 7. So just your regular formula that you're testing, that does all those things. And I have a custom WordPress module that uses WordPress CLI in order to set up the base WordPress setup commands. It's still running. What we'll look at next is the tests. In this case, we're using pytest. So I have a conf test that gives me some extra pytest fixtures. This is basically the logic to figure out which, when I was writing this, I was testing Windows and FreeBSD. So I have a Paramiko and a Windows set up as well so that it could test Enfer, it could run against them. But right now, all we're doing is pulling this kitchen underscore username and kitchen container ID from the environment variables and then connecting to Docker using those. And then the host fixture will return that host object. And then I have a salt fixture, which has a specific configuration location for kitchen salt that then creates a partial function that automatically passes the configuration to the salt testing fixture and then allows me to just run commands against salt inside of this container. And then the last 2 are finding the HTTP port and IP address of the Docker container so that I can make requests and verify that my WordPress site has been set up. So we'll look at test WordPress. Right now, all this one is doing is it uses the the host IP and the HTTP port, and it just curls and makes sure that I get a 200 error back or 200 response code back. And then it also makes sure that it's been set up for the specific host name that I specified in my pillars, and that that's returned in the response text. We're getting close. Are there any other questions?
What's passing the address and port?
That's the so in pytest you have these fixtures where if you just specify a variable, pytest will automatically pass that variable if you specified the fixture. So I can do all my logic in this conf test.py file, and pytest will pass those variables on to any function that I specify them in. Yes?
So I'll use kitchen salt already at the moment. So my question is on the dependencies. So I have a private repository of all the dependencies how do you get it all down and grab the private dependencies? Because at the moment, I can get shelves outside of the formula to grab those before I actually do dependencies.
So the question was, how do you grab dependencies from private Git repositories? There is a dependency where you can say, instead of specifying a Git repository, you can just specify path and then a path to your private repo. That's the easiest way to do it right this second. We definitely need to add the ability to pull from private repositories. Right now what it's doing is it's pulling down the Git repositories inside of the container. My goal is to move all that to outside of the container so that it puts it into the sandbox beforehand. This was one of the things that was in Kitchen Salt before we took it over, and it's one of the things that I definitely want to change. But this is using the path is a quick way to do it right now. Yes?
Have you tried using the SFTP transport?
For,
File transfers.
I don't know, for Kitchen Salt or Test Kitchen?
For kitchen. They have a SFTP versus the normal Glasser transport.
Yes. I have not tried using, so right now we're not actually transferring anything.
The container you are.
We're not transferring right now. Right now it's running the high state.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The question was if we'd use the SFTP transporter yet to transfer files in. I haven't yet, but I'm being told that that is faster if you choose to do that.
Is it smart enough to know which files are already in there?
Ooh, that's good.
Change, rather than dumping all of them all the time?
Yeah.
Because one of the things I found with Test Kitchen is that if I have a folder of all the states, it transfers all of them, not just
Right.
the ones I specified. And
So-
this transport doesn't.
SFTP will only transfer the files that have changed.
It's called Kitchen Sync. SYNC.
Perfect. It's called Kitchen Sync. I wish this would run faster. I'm going to go ahead and start talking about some of the other stuff that we're doing with Test Kitchen, and we'll get back to see that output in a second. So, so that was the first thing that we did was figure out how to start testing, and we merged all the pull requests and started actually looking at the issues over there to try to start building a community. Oh, I think it just finished. Perfect. So you'll just see it runs through my high state, it installs PHP, it installs Apache, it configures MySQL, it will configure MySQL, it'll start the MariaDB service, set the root password, delete the anonymous, so inside of this MySQL formula, if you've never used it, they took everything from MySQL's secure installation and converted it into state files. Highly recommended. The guy that did it is awesome. And then we download WordPress, we set up the file, it runs my WordPress module using WordPress CLI to do the install, and then at the end it switches over to the verifier and it runs unit tests as if you were running just anything else, and then it destroys it at the very end. 10 minutes isn't bad. So we wanted to try to build a community around this project, and we want to pull it in. So I'm already talking to Bloomberg about working with them on adding multi-node support. Right now, as you can see, it only does salt-call --local state.high-state with some extra stuff where you can set logging to debug and you can force color and very simple things. But the next step is, how do we make the Salt testing suite easy for people to run? So over the last week, basically the last month, we've started adding all of our branch tests to use Kitchen Salt, so that anybody in the community can use them to run the entire test suite in a Docker container or in whatever driver you want to use locally, so that as you're contributing to Salt, you can actually run the test suite instead of having to push code to Salt's repository or Salt's pull requests and then wait for everything to come back and say, oh, Pylint failed. So right now, the biggest change is we added this remote states, and it will That shouldn't be there. But this portion right here just says, go do a git clone on this. This is the branch, and this is the type of repository it is. And right now it only supports Git. Anybody that wants to add the SVN for me, you can add that on your own time. But basically we're running everything that we run in Jenkins and test every day. We're able to run inside of this. And then we are going to be working on moving over the next short period of time to moving all of our testing suite into our internal cloud using this so that it is more stable and it runs on the same environment every time, and we don't get random updates from our cloud provider that removes curl for some reason. And then we'll be testing Python 2 and Python 3. And basically, we'll use the same commands that the community uses. On top of this, there's a new directory that this just got merged yesterday. There's a new directory called kitchen inside of the tests directory. What is in here is a kitchen.yml file that is completely templated. So it has defaults for platforms and drivers so that you can provide, if you're writing code for Salt, instead of having to go through the entire Salt test suite, try to figure out how that portion runs, you just have to provide a containerized area where you provide us states, and we'll use Kitchen to spin up an instance inside of the test suite that then if you just provide a state that just installs Postgres, then you can run tests against that using Postgres or using pytest, and you don't have to run the entire Salt test suite and run the entire Salt Jenkins state repository in order to test something on your own in just a small containerized world. Let's see, what else have we done? We've also started testing our Salt Jenkins tests. Everything that we test on, we also test for making sure that we're able to deploy Salt into our testing environment. So if you want to see more different ways to configure Test Kitchen, all those are over in our Salt Jenkins repository as well. Question?
It's invoking those templates, templated kitchen YAML.
Which one?
So with the platforms.yaml one, how do you work with that?
The question was for the platforms.yaml inside of the kitchen stuff, how do you work with it? There's an example test suite that's just this WordPress formula moved into the Salt test suite in order to show, but let me get into there. What'll happen is we're in test/kitchen, and there's one test in here called test_kitchen.py. What it'll do is it will iterate over the current directory and tack on tests, and it'll iterate over that directory, and every directory that's in there will have a different formula that will it'll basically just run this kitchen converge, and it'll run it using 999 because there's no -C0 to just run all of them at the same time. And then we run this last verify all separately so that we can see the unit tests at the end. But let's see. In here, I have a driver, a pillar, a platform, and a provisioner. So pillars is just the pillars portion. Platforms is just the platforms portion. And then the provisioner is usually just the extra stuff that goes into the provisioner, so that you can template and we have some constraints on the way that it works, but for the most part, it allows some customization for the way that our users are going to write test suites. And this is one of the ways that we want to move forward to make it easier for the community to write tests, because we desperately need tests. Are there any questions? Okay. I'm 15 minutes early, and here we go.
Comment.
Okay.
Some of the other drivers, if you're using Cloud Provider or containers, what's really nice about the test kitchen is that you can create an image of those items and run your states against them to literally see what's going to happen to something that you might not have visibility for. So to create an AMI and EC2 of a production server and iteratively test your state until you get the state the way you want it, tear it down, build it up, tear it down, you're going to get an end result on your production box that you already know what's going to happen. You build your state file to address it, it already applies cleanly. So the third-party drivers, anywhere from Docker to SSH as a driver, where it doesn't create a VM, it just connects to one, makes this really nice to do kind of reconnaissance before actually having to bust down the door of your actual system.
So I forgot about this portion. I have also included some example testing services. So unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to play with the new Jenkins 2.0 that includes a Jenkins file inside of the Git repository. But I did include a Travis CI example and a Circle CI example, as well as a drone example for all those different types of tests if you want to try out one of the newer CI/CD pipeline programs. Question? Yes. There.
I was going to ask about coverage and all the stuff you can stick in formulas. This covers things that run in the menu, like execution modules and the states that need them. Is there any vision to like try to get stuff, other stuff you can do covered?
So the question was, this covers execution modules and state modules on the minion. Is there any plan to get anything else to be covered? Yes. Like I said, I'm going to be hopefully working with Bloomberg. I was talking to them yesterday, and they said that they were about to start working on multi-node, and I was saying that I really want to work on multi-node. So my vision would be that you could create a Salt master and multiple minions of different distributions and be able to. It would obviously require more work in the pytest or in the testing portion, but my vision is to be able to test beacons where you create a Python module that you start up a beacon on a minion that uses iNotify to watch a directory, and then you create a process that you spin off or a thread inside of Python, which is always fun, and you listen to the event bus, and then you go and touch a file in that directory using Salt, and then you bring that other process back and check and see if that event actually came across, and to be able to test everything that you could possibly think of doing, if that event came and if it actually triggered a reaction.
And the reactor is the orchestration.
Yep. Once you have multi-node, my goal would be to be able to figure out how to get pytest to be able to test all of that, yes. Any other?
So the kitchen YAML file, I think you talked about in the description of the talk that it kind of duplicates a lot of stuff that would be in your normal state files? Or is it just all the extra stuff, like your top SLS that needs to go in there?
It would just be, so the question was what if we're duplicating anything in there. Some of the stuff that you might duplicate would be if you're storing pillars, you can actually, there is an option for pulling your pillars from files. So if you store your pillars in the same Git repository, you can specify just use these files to run my tests. But if you're not storing them there, then you need to specify a pillars option. Outside of that, just the top file. And if you include it, it is possible also to include a top file in there, and it will sync it to the box and just use that top file. So it's only not really duplication, but it can have some duplication in order to simplify and test specific things. Question over here.
What about external pillars?
Anything that you can put into, okay, so it runs salt-call-local, but anything that you can put in a formula, it can test. So if you put an underscore pillars directory in the root and you use is_file_root, you can use it. In this example, I'm using a custom execution module and custom state. Any other questions? All right. Time. Yeah.